In a land where silence breathes through ancient trees, where fog weaves like fingers through the roots of forgotten souls, there lies a place that does not give back the living. Aokigahara, the sea of trees. A forest whose name echoes with sorrow, whose soil remembers every final step. But this is not just a story about the forest. This is a story about a mirror once used in a forbidden ritual, a mirror that does not reflect but replaces, a vessel for longing, for grief, for something left unfinished. They say love can transcend death, but what happens when it refuses to let go? Tonight, you will step into a slow-burning nightmare, a haunting tale whispered through broken vows, trapped between glass and shadow, where time stands still and the dead wait patiently for their wedding day. This is the story of the Mirror Bride of Aokigahara.
The sky over Yamanashi was a pale, dispassionate gray, the kind that seemed neither ready for rain nor willing to offer light. A soft breeze trembled through the early autumn branches, sending red maple leaves fluttering like embers across the forest's edge. Aokigahara. To outsiders, it was a simple forest, lush, quiet, mysterious perhaps. But to the locals, it was a place of solemn dread. It was never just trees. It was whispers, shadows, things left behind. Takashi Mori stepped out of the narrow taxi, shouldered his old canvas satchel, and faced the silent wall of green before him. He didn't need the driver to say it. They never did. The way they averted their eyes when taking you here said enough. No one came to Aokigahara to picnic. He glanced down at the camera slung around his neck, an old battered Nikon from the 80s, still running film. Digital wouldn't do for this. The imperfections mattered, the silence mattered, and the weight of each click, each roll of film reminded him that these photographs weren't meant for spectacle. They were for memory, for mourning, for closure. Takashi wasn't a thrill seeker. He wasn't a ghost hunter or a blogger hoping for viral clicks. He was a photojournalist. More importantly, he was a man hollowed by grief, one who had long stopped pretending that life made sense after losing his wife in a slow, unspeakable silence 2 winters ago. This trip wasn't assigned. It wasn't commissioned. It was a pilgrimage. His boots sank slightly into the mossy earth as he passed the first signpost. It warned of unstable ground, disorientation, and encouraged visitors to reconsider. The trees loomed high, not towering, but densely packed, as if holding secrets too tightly to let them rise. Takashi walked alone. Each step deeper into Aokigahara muffled the world behind him. Birdsong faded. Wind seemed to stop. Even the crunch of leaves underfoot grew quieter, as though the forest had reached into his ears and pressed down. He paused occasionally to snap a photo, not of anything specific, just impressions. A scarf snagged on a low branch, an empty plastic water bottle turned green with age, a pair of shoes carefully placed side by side at the base of a tree. He had read the signs before, not the metal ones nailed to trunks, but the human ones. When people came here to die, they often wandered far, then left their shoes neatly, as if to suggest they hoped someone would find them. Or maybe it was their final act of order in a life that had spiraled beyond their control. As Takashi knelt to photograph the shoes, he felt something strange, a shift in the air. The light dimmed, though clouds hadn't thickened. The wind returned, but only at his back, and a smell, faint, earthy, old, rose from the ground. He stood and turned slowly. That's when he saw it. A clearing, small, easy to miss, the kind the forest didn't offer easily. In its center stood a cedar tree, far older than the others, with gnarled roots coiled like sleeping snakes. Something shimmered faintly beneath them. He moved closer, each step cautious, drawn not by curiosity, but something deeper, recognition. Half buried in the moss and soil was a rectangular frame, antique, perhaps early 20th century. Its wood was dark with age, etched with carvings worn soft by time. He reached down, brushing aside dead leaves and threads of root. It was heavier than expected. When he finally lifted it free, a chill passed through him. An old mirror, cracked in one corner, the glass fogged by condensation and time, yet intact. The moment he touched it, he felt something thrum beneath his skin. Not a sound, but a sensation, like his heartbeat syncing with something ancient. Takashi didn't know why he didn't leave it, why he wrapped it carefully in a scarf and placed it in his satchel, why he whispered, "I'll take you home," without fully knowing what he meant. But he did, and the forest, for the first time in hours, seemed to exhale. The train ride back to Tokyo was silent. The mirror rested beside him on the seat, swaddled like a fragile child. No one sat near him, though the car wasn't full. He stared at the trees passing outside the window, but in the reflection of the glass, he swore he saw something else. Not himself, a pale silhouette, hair pinned high in a traditional shimada, a hint of red at the shoulder, gone the moment he blinked. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of light, his mind playing games steeped in grief and too much solitude. But when he arrived at his apartment, a cramped, neat third-floor walk-up in Meguro, and placed the mirror against the far wall of his workroom, the room felt colder. Not in temperature, in spirit. As he unpacked his gear, poured tea, and lit the small incense burner on his desk, he caught himself glancing at the mirror again. Nothing strange, just his reflection. Except his expression. It looked softer. Not his usual tight-lipped exhaustion. His reflection seemed to smile, just slightly. But he wasn't. Takashi blinked, looked again. The smile was gone. He closed the curtain, turned off the light, and tried to sleep. But the room felt occupied. In the hallway mirror, he thought he saw movement. In the kettle's steel surface, a red flicker. In his dreams that night, the forest returned, quiet, fog-laced, infinite. And standing just beyond the tree line was a woman in red, waiting. The morning light filtered in through sheer curtains, gentle and golden, but it did little to soften the feeling that something was off. Takashi Mori sat at his kitchen table, sipping lukewarm tea, the mirror leaning silently against the far wall of his workroom just beyond the open doorway. It hadn't moved, it hadn't made a sound, but it felt alive. He told himself he was being ridiculous. He was a man of reason, of angles and light and timing, a photographer, not a mystic. The weight of grief and solitude could distort things. He knew this. He had lived it. Still, he found himself glancing toward the workroom more than usual. He wasn't checking the mirror. He was checking around it,
as if expecting to see something else, something standing beside it, watching. He shook off the thought and opened his photo binder. He'd developed the previous day's rolls overnight, a routine he'd perfected over the years. But as he flipped through the prints, his breath caught. In one photo, taken near the old cedar tree, there was a faint white blur behind him. Not dust, not a smudge, something vertical, shaped like a woman. In another, her form appeared again, partially obscured behind a tree. Still no detail, just presence. He stared at the prints for several long minutes. Then, reluctantly, he rose and walked back into the workroom. The mirror stood where he'd left it, wrapped loosely in the old scarf, its frame now dry, though the carvings had grown more distinct as the moss dried and fell away. The patterns, swirls, waves, flowers, had been common in pre-war craftsmanship. But there was one odd symbol at the base he hadn't noticed before. A small circle flanked by two lines, etched with a sharpness that seemed newer than the rest, almost like an eye. Takashi crouched beside it and slowly unwrapped the scarf. The glass was still fogged in patches, but clean. He lifted a cloth and wiped it gently, revealing more of the reflective surface. His own face looked back at him, tired eyes, unshaven jaw, a gray streak in his hair that had arrived too early. He leaned closer. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, his reflection blinked. It wasn't the blink that chilled him, it was the timing. He hadn't blinked, but the man in the mirror had, just a split second too soon, like a badly dubbed film. He jerked back, and the mirror remained still, his reflection perfectly normal again. His heart pounded, his hand trembled. "No more night shoots," he muttered, forcing a dry laugh. "Lack of sleep is making me see things." But even as he said it, he knew this wasn't exhaustion. It was something else. That evening, Takashi tried to work. He had a deadline for a small gallery showing, Tokyo's urban decay, captured in grainy black and white. It should have been easy, but every time he looked at a contact sheet or tried to edit a photo, his eyes drifted toward the workroom, toward the mirror. It was covered again, wrapped tightly in the scarf just in case, but he still felt it, still heard it, because now the crying had begun. It was faint, so faint he thought it was coming from the hallway at first, a soft weeping, as if someone were sitting just outside his door. He opened the door. No one. But the sound remained. It wasn't in the hallway. It was in the mirror. He stepped slowly into the workroom. The air felt colder, still, as though even the city traffic outside had hushed. The sound was clearer now, gentle sobs, soft and mournful, rising from within the glass. He stood in front of it, heart pounding, palms damp. Slowly, he pulled the scarf down. The mirror was fogged again, almost opaque, but there, beneath the blur, the faint outline of a face, pale, eyes downcast, lips trembling. He gasped and stumbled back, nearly knocking over a lamp. The image vanished, no trace, just his own reflection once again. He wrapped the mirror and shoved it into his storage closet. Slamming the door, he leaned against it, chest heaving. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning brought sunlight and the comforting sound of distant traffic. Takashi tried to dismiss everything as a bad dream, a moment of spiraling imagination fueled by fatigue and loneliness. He even managed to smile when he stepped into the kitchen. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Tea, toast, familiar quiet. Until he turned toward the hallway mirror,
and saw himself, smiling, wide, calm, peaceful. But he wasn't smiling. His lips were pressed into a thin, confused line, his brow furrowed, but the reflection was different. It smiled gently at him, and then, slowly, blinked. The same mistimed blink. His teacup dropped from his hand and shattered across the floor. The reflection remained unchanged, smiling, blinking, staring. Takashi backed away until the mirror was out of sight. Then he locked himself in his bedroom, curtains drawn, phone off. The daylight did nothing to calm him. He heard the weeping again, always faint, always near. That night he dreamed of her. She stood just beyond the tree line of Aokigahara, the same dream as before, only now her features were clearer. Her bridal kimono was not white, but red, crimson, and deep, as though dyed in something older than ink. Her veil covered her face, but she raised one hand toward him, not beckoning, offering. And in her other hand, she held a mirror. Takashi reached forward, and just as his fingertips touched the glass, she whispered, "Now you will stay." He woke, gasping, drenched in sweat, heart racing. The storage closet door was ajar, the scarf lay crumpled on the floor, and the mirror sat quietly in the center of the workroom, upright, waiting.
The next morning arrived without permission. Light crept through the cracks in Takashi's curtains like intruders, falling across a face that hadn't truly slept. He had drifted in and out of broken dreams, fragmented images, a veil rippling in fog, lips sewn shut with thread, the glint of something sharp just beneath skin. The mirror was still there, centered in his workroom, precisely where it hadn't been the night before. He hadn't moved it, of that he was certain. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching it, not daring to enter, not daring to speak. The mirror no longer looked like an object, it looked like an opening, a suggestion of somewhere else, still, reflective, patient. The frame had darkened overnight. The wood now looked freshly lacquered, and the faint carvings near the base, waves, eyes, and lotus petals, had deepened in definition. It was as if the mirror had aged in reverse, becoming clearer with each passing day. Takashi approached cautiously. There was no reflection at first, only a milky fog across the glass. Then, slowly, it cleared. And she appeared, not behind him, not beside him, within. A bride, dressed in a blood-red kimono, embroidered with black cranes, her face pale, her lips painted a deep, mournful crimson. Her eyes did not glow or weep, they watched, steady and grieving, as if seeing him from the other side of death. Her veil flowed around her like smoke. She held a mirror in her hands, a small, circular one, bound with red ribbon, cracked in its center. Her mouth moved, but Takashi heard nothing, and yet he knew what she was saying. Finish the ritual. The mirror rippled. He stumbled backward, heart racing, and the image vanished. His own reflection returned, pale, shaken, sweat glistening on his forehead. But he couldn't shake her gaze. It lingered behind his eyes, etched into the silence. That afternoon, Takashi left his apartment for the first time in 3 days. He needed answers. He headed to the National Library in Ueno, a place where silence was sacred, but knowledge whispered from every shelf.
He combed through books on Japanese funerary practices, Shinto rituals, and obscure folklore. Most of what he found was vague, poetic, wrapped in metaphor and myth. But one passage caught his eye. In times of grief too great for the body to contain, the mirror may serve as vessel for that which is lost. In the ritual of Kagami no Kon, the bride may wed the spirit of the departed through mirrored vows. But if the ritual is unfinished, the soul shall linger between realms, half reflected, half forgotten. It was referenced in a 1927 field journal by a rural priest from Yamanashi. Kagami no Kon, the mirror wedding. Takashi felt his blood run cold. This wasn't just a story. It wasn't just symbolism. Someone had performed this ritual, and it had gone wrong. He jotted down names, locations, anything that hinted at the forest, at brides in red, at lost rituals whispered in corners of old temples. One name kept surfacing: Sanae Koizumi, a young woman who had vanished into Aokigahara in the spring of 1953. Her fiancé had died in a car crash the day before their wedding. The obituary said she was inconsolable. A week later, she disappeared. Her family believed she had followed him into death. Her body was never found, but she had left her bridal kimono folded neatly on her bed, and her mirror was missing. That night, Takashi returned home with the weight of the dead pressing on his shoulders. He didn't light the lamps, he didn't make tea. He simply stood in front of the mirror, breathing slowly, waiting. Fog began to form on the glass again, thicker this time, like mist rolling in through trees. And then she was there, closer, clearer. This time she spoke, not with her mouth, but through his own thoughts, a voice that wasn't his, a sorrow that wasn't his. He left before the vows. I waited, still waiting. Takashi's hands trembled. His throat was dry, but he managed to whisper, "Who are you?" The veil lifted. Her face was young, beautiful, but marred by grief so ancient it had become part of her. Eyes black as ink, lips gently parted, trembling. Sanae. The name echoed like wind in a shrine. I didn't know. I didn't mean to. You brought me home. A tear slid down his cheek, but it wasn't his own. He wasn't sure anymore. I'm not him. I'm not your groom. But the mirror pulsed softly. The veil fell again. The bride turned, and as she did, Takashi saw not just her reflection, but his own, standing beside her, dressed in ceremonial robes. He was smiling. She was not. He didn't sleep. He sat on the floor of his workroom, back against the wall, eyes locked on the mirror through the dark. No more cries, no more whispers, only waiting. By dawn, his eyes were bloodshot, his breath shallow. And as sunlight crept across the floor, he saw something new. Footprints, small, bare, wet, trailing from the mirror to where he sat. He followed them with his gaze and saw, just faintly, in the kitchen's reflective tiles, a bride standing behind him. There's a moment, somewhere between waking and sleep, when the world feels just unfamiliar enough to question. When the walls of your home look softer than they should,
when silence grows too loud, when you blink and something has shifted. Takashi Mori lived in that moment now, constantly. The mirror had not moved, not physically. It still sat in the same place, leaning against the wall of his workroom. But something behind the glass had tilted, like a room turned by degrees, like a world bending beneath his feet. He no longer knew what day it was. He no longer cared. The footprints had dried by morning. No trace remained. He tried to photograph them in the weak early light, but every shot came back blank. No prints, no shadows, no figure. Only one constant, the mirror, and his reflection, subtly wrong. It smiled when he didn't, blinked too early, tilted its head just slightly out of sync, like a puppet unsure of its strings. Sometimes it looked behind him before he could turn. Sometimes it watched him when he left the room. The weeping returned that night, not faint now, but right at the edge of his hearing, as if someone were standing just beyond the wall, mourning endlessly through paper-thin silence. Takashi covered every reflective surface in his apartment, windows, picture frames, even his bathroom sink. Still, she came. In puddles, in shadows on the floor, in the black glass of his phone when it powered off. Always in red, always watching, always waiting. He dreamed of her again. This time the dream did not begin in the forest. It began in his apartment. But the walls were twisted, elongated. The colors bled together like wet paint. Fog clung to the floor. His furniture was gone, replaced by red lacquered altars, sticks of incense burning with no flame, and a trail of paper cranes hanging from the ceiling like nooses. In the center of the room stood the mirror, upright now, framed with braided cords of white and red, ceremonial shide papers streaming from its top like a sacred gate. And beside it, she waited, the bride, veiled, silent. When he stepped forward, his feet made no sound. The mirror's surface shimmered like water. He raised his hand. "Why me?" he asked. Her voice arrived like wind chimes caught in fog, gentle, distant, cold. "You found me. I didn't mean to. You uncovered the vow. I didn't make it. You looked into the mirror." She lifted her veil. Her face was the same, serene, pale, unreadable. But now it was close, too close, inches from his. "Now you will stay." Takashi awoke screaming, soaked in sweat. The mirror was at the foot of his bed, unwrapped, fogged, and this time he didn't see his reflection at all. The following days bled into one another. He stopped answering calls, stopped leaving the apartment. He barely ate. The world outside his windows looked distant, like a dream glimpsed through someone else's eyes. Inside, the mirror's presence thickened. Its reflection began to show things that weren't real. Trees where walls should be, fog drifting through the hallway, a figure sitting in his chair when it was clearly empty. Once, while brushing his teeth, Takashi looked up and saw a version of himself, but younger, smiling, dressed in ceremonial robes, the same robes he had seen in the bride's vision. His reflection raised a hand, not a wave, a beckoning. Behind that version of himself stood the bride, veiled down, weeping. He sought help, or tried to. He called a local shrine in Meguro, explained that he had found an old mirror in Aokigahara, that strange things had begun happening,
that he wasn't sure if he was being haunted or losing his mind. There was a pause. Then a soft voice. "Is it carved with the eye of Enmusubi?" "Yes," Takashi whispered. "I think so." "Then it's not a haunting. It's a binding." "What does that mean?" "You didn't take a mirror. You accepted an invitation." The call disconnected. That night, he smashed it. He took the mirror to the bathtub and brought down a hammer with all his strength. The glass shattered beneath the weight, spraying shards across porcelain like crystal rain. He wept. But in the morning, it was whole again, sitting calmly in the center of his workroom, clean, polished, and worse, now it reflected things from before. His wife, his old apartment, moments he never photographed, but now played out behind the glass like memories on loop. Private moments, fights, kisses, her last days in the hospital, pale and fading. He collapsed to his knees. "This isn't yours," he whispered. The mirror darkened, and then she spoke again, not in dreams, but aloud from within the room. "But you are." That evening, something changed in Takashi. He stood in front of the mirror for hours, unmoving. The light around him dimmed. His eyes no longer blinked. His lips, dry and cracked, moved silently, reciting words he didn't know. He found himself lighting incense. He found himself cleaning the apartment, folding clothes, preparing space. He found in his closet a black kimono. He didn't remember buying it, but it fit perfectly. He stood before the mirror one last time. Fog rolled behind the glass. The bride waited. He raised his hand. So did she. They touched the glass from opposite sides. It rippled, and he smiled for the first time in years. By morning, Takashi no longer feared the mirror. He feared what it wanted. He walked through his apartment in silence, every surface now wrapped in faint fog. The mirror hadn't moved since last night, but the world around it had. He saw strands of red thread tangled in his curtains, shide paper tied to doorknobs. The incense burned constantly now, and its sweet, bitter scent clung to his clothing, to his hair, to his tongue. Still, part of him resisted, a small, rational voice struggling to breathe beneath layers of ritual and obsession. So he did the only thing that voice could think to do. He left. Outside, the world continued as if untouched. The streets of Tokyo buzzed with late-morning traffic. Neon signs blinked. Strangers passed him without a second glance. But Takashi didn't go to work. He didn't go to the gallery. He took a train south, back to the place where it all began, Aokigahara. The forest welcomed him like an old wound. The air grew heavier the deeper he walked. This time, he didn't bring his camera. He didn't need it. He wasn't documenting anymore. He was searching. The trail curved, then split. He turned left, following the same instincts that had guided him days before. His feet seemed to remember even if his mind did not. Within minutes, he reached the clearing. The old cedar still stood like a sentinel, and at its base, the earth freshly disturbed, moss parted like lips in prayer. He saw it. A hollow. It hadn't been there before. Carefully, Takashi crouched. He reached into the shallow depression and pulled free something wrapped in waxed paper. Time and moisture had worn it thin. Inside, he found a set of items wrapped in faded silk. a hair comb carved from bone, a strip of crimson ribbon, and a brittle photograph, warped from age, but still legible. Two people, a young couple, standing before a shrine. He recognized her instantly. The bride, Sanae Koizumi. Her smile was soft, reserved. Her fiancé beside her, handsome, awkward in his posture, held her hand with both of his. Takashi held the photo to his chest. The weight of grief, not his own, crushed his lungs. That's when he heard it. Not weeping, singing. A lullaby, soft, carried by the breeze. He turned. A figure stood at the forest's edge, old, hunched, draped in black. A woman. She sat on a worn bench at the edge of the pilgrimage path, her cane resting across her knees. Her eyes were pale with age, but sharp with memory. Takashi bowed deeply. "I'm sorry to disturb you." "She brought her back, didn't you?" the woman whispered. He froze. "You know about her?" "I saw the mirror in your hands when you left. I didn't stop you. Perhaps I should have." She looked up. Takashi sat beside her in silence. She continued, voice low and wind-worn. "Sanae Koizumi. She came here in the spring of 1953. Her fiancé died the night before their wedding. Drunk driver on the highway. She didn't cry at the funeral. She only asked for one thing, his wedding robe." "Why?" Takashi asked. "To marry him anyway. The old ways, they were still whispered back then. The ritual of Kagami no Kan, mirror weddings, posthumous vows. A bride may wed a dead man if the ritual is performed before his soul crosses over." Takashi shivered. But it wasn't finished. No, something went wrong. She came to the forest with the mirror, dressed in red, the color for death and love. But the priest who agreed to help her vanished. Perhaps he feared what he summoned. Perhaps he died too. All that was ever found was her ribbon and her mirror. Takashi looked down at the photo. "She's still here. She found me." The woman's fingers gripped the bench. "Then the vow is still incomplete. I don't want to be part of it. She's chosen you." The walk back was slower. The forest seemed to press in tighter, the trees denser, their trunks stained black by moisture and silence. He saw shadows where there were none, heard footsteps that didn't match his own. He left the photo at the base of the cedar. He couldn't bring himself to take it with him. When he returned to the edge of the forest, the sun had dipped behind the mountains. The world was already dim. As he reached the main road, he turned one last time and saw her, Sanae, standing in the grove, veiled, silent. But this time, she bowed, deep, formal, ritualistic. "Thank you." The train rocked gently as it sped through the outskirts of Tokyo. Takashi stared at the reflection in the window. Not himself, the other him, the one who now smiled easily, who sat a little straighter, dressed a little older, wiser, as if something ancient had begun to settle in his skin. He blinked. His reflection didn't. Back home, the apartment was colder, still. He stepped inside. The mirror was waiting, fogged, yet pulsing with quiet light. This time, he didn't run. He knelt before it, laid his palms on the frame, and whispered, I know your name now." A ripple spread across the glass, then a soft whisper echoed from within. "And now I know yours." Takashi stopped hearing the city. That's how it began. No honking, no train rumble, no midnight ambulance howls. The world outside his apartment faded, not into silence, but into distance, as if every sound had stepped back behind a thin, invisible curtain. In their place came something softer, the sound of water. It started as a drip, then a whisper, then something melodic, the echo of her voice. He first heard it in the kitchen sink. Standing over it, hands in cold dishwater, the ripples trembled with sound. Not a song, not words, just soft syllables, old mourning syllables, like someone praying through tears beneath the surface. He turned off the faucet. Still, it came. His eyes fixed on the drain, and for a moment he thought he saw it deepen, as though the metal spiral opened not into plumbing, but something deeper, something with no bottom. He staggered back, heart pounding. But the voice followed. In the shower, the water streamed with whispers. When steam rose on the mirror, she appeared. A pale face, eyes hollow, yet full of longing, always close, always watching. He stopped using the bathroom mirror after that. Even tea became unbearable. The surface trembled, and from within the brown swirl of liquid came her image, lips moving slowly, repeating the same word, "Aishiteru." I love you. Takashi barely spoke anymore. He moved through his apartment like a man underwater. The lines between reality and reflection blurred. The mirror remained in the workroom, unchanged, and yet everything else began to reflect her. He unplugged his phone, turned off the television, removed the hard drive from his laptop. But it didn't help, because even still water spoke her name. At night he dreamed of corridors made of glass, hallways lined with mirrors, all reflecting different versions of himself, young, old, smiling, broken, and always her behind him, just out of reach. He tried to run, but the mirrors bent around him, trapping him in endless loops. In one dream, he reached into the mirror to touch her hand. It was warm, real. When he woke, his fingers were damp. He returned to the library, desperate for meaning, for answers, for someone to anchor him. But the books gave him no comfort. They spoke of rituals, of mirror spirits, of ancient customs outlawed by modernity. Fragments of belief still practiced in shadow, where grief is too strong to let the dead go. One passage lingered in his mind. If the soul of the departed cannot be joined with the living through proper rites, the spirit may linger near water, mirrors, or polished stone, places of stillness, awaiting reunion. It made sense now. She had found her vessel, and she had found him. He tried again to destroy the mirror, this time with fire. He took it to the rooftop of his building at dusk, lit incense, drenched the frame in alcohol, struck a match with trembling hands. The flames sparked, flames licked the edges of the wood, but they refused to spread. Instead, the flames died in silence. Smoke rose, shaped like a hand reaching skyward, then vanished. The mirror remained unscathed, not even scorched, just fogged and smiling. Back in his apartment, everything became ritual. He moved methodically, swept in straight lines, laid offerings of rice and sake at the mirror's feet. folded paper cranes he did not remember how to fold, tied red threads around his wrists to keep himself from sleepwalking. None of it helped, because every time he blinked, she came closer, and her voice, once water, was now in him. She spoke through his lips while he slept. He recorded himself one night and listened in horror to the tape. A soft female voice, chanting old wedding vows, in perfectly pronounced pre-war Japanese. He didn't know the language, not that version, not the accent, and yet there she was, speaking through his breath. On the 7th night, he found himself kneeling before the mirror again, not in fear, but in surrender. His hands rested in his lap, his shoulders relaxed. The bride stood behind the glass, veil down, hair pinned in an elaborate bridal style, adorned with bells and flowers now blackened by time. This time she did not look at him. She looked at his reflection, smiled, and whispered, "We are almost ready." The air in the room thickened. The glass began to shimmer. Behind her, he saw figures, faint, ghostly, men in ceremonial robes, their faces blank, eyeless, mouths sewn shut, past suitors, failed grooms, souls that had not been strong enough, were willing. Takashi stared at them, each of them frozen in time, faces pressed to the inside of the glass. He understood now. The mirror wasn't just a doorway, it was a tomb, and he was the only one she'd ever let speak. The water in his glass began to tremble. His reflection turned its head without him and whispered, "She's chosen you."
Takashi woke with the taste of incense in his mouth. Not the scent, the taste. As if he had swallowed smoke in his sleep, and it had coiled itself along his tongue like a memory too bitter to forget. The mirror stood motionless across the room, but the fog on its surface pulsed like breath against glass, slow, rhythmic, almost gentle, waiting. The next day, he found himself in a narrow alley behind an old Buddhist temple in Shinjuku. He had followed a trail of half-legible articles, translated blog posts, and decades-old interviews preserved in quiet corners of the internet. They all pointed to one name, Reverend Nakata Osamu, a priest who had served in a rural Yamanashi shrine during the 1940s and 50s. He was known for unconventional practices, for helping grieving families perform unsanctioned rituals, especially those involving mirrors, death, and the veil between. The last mention of him was in 1953, the same year Sanai vanished. Takashi had to know more. Inside the temple archives, the air smelled of old paper and lacquered wood. A monk in simple robes guided him to a small reading chamber, wordless, reverent. Takashi opened a binder marked post-war records and flipped through page after page of names, dates, ceremonial logs. And then he found it. Entry, March 5, 1953. Sanai Koizumi of Minobu came to me today. She was grieving, beyond what I have seen in most. Her fiancé, Haruki Toma, perished just hours before their ceremony. She begged me to help her complete the wedding, not for closure, she said, for union, for permanence, for eternity. She brought with her an heirloom mirror, family kept, consecrated in blood and vow. She wished to be bound to him before his soul crossed over. I told her it was dangerous, but I agreed. Takashi's hands trembled. The next page was torn. What followed was only a loose scrap, handwritten and faded by time. The ritual began. The mirror pulsed. The veil fluttered without wind, and I saw her, not Sanai, but something wearing her skin, smiling through glass before she ever smiled in person. No signature, no date, just silence. He left the temple shaken, not afraid, saddened. It became clear to him then, this wasn't the story of a vengeful ghost. It was the story of love gone too far, a bride abandoned by fate, a groom stolen too soon, a ritual begun with hope and left incomplete. He wondered if Haruki had ever been there, inside the mirror, beside her, waiting. Or had he passed on, leaving her trapped? He had to know. That evening, he traveled to Minobu, a small town nestled in Yamanashi, quiet and steeped in tradition. The houses still bore the curve of ancient roofs. Local shrines stood shaded by cherry trees not yet in bloom. He wandered the stone paths until he found it, a graveyard, small, tucked behind an abandoned shrine. There, beneath a broken wooden gate, he found them, Haruki Toma, 1930 to 1953, beloved son, awaited groom. Beside it, a small, weather-worn stone. No name, just a carved mirror. The villagers knew, even if they didn't speak of it. Takashi knelt and pressed his hand to the cold grave, and for the first time in weeks, the whispering stopped. Back in Tokyo, the apartment welcomed him like a breath held too long. The mirror hadn't moved, but something had changed. The fog was lighter, the glass clearer, the room quieter. He sat before it, exhausted. "I found him," he said softly. The bride appeared, slowly, like breath forming on glass. She wore no veil this time, just sorrow. Not rage, not hunger, grief. Takashi whispered, "He's not with you, is he?" Her head bowed, not in shame, in mourning. He felt something break inside him, not fear, but recognition. He knew what it meant to lose someone and never get them back, to want something so badly you'd bargain with death. And when death says nothing, you start listening to the mirrors instead. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Her eyes lifted. For the first time, she looked directly at him and wept. He dreamed of her again that night, but this time it wasn't a forest or a mirrored hallway. It was a shrine. He stood across from her in a ceremonial space, lanterns lit, the scent of cherry bark incense rising in slow curls. She held out her hands, in them a ribbon, a ring, and a mirror, cracked but gleaming. She opened her mouth to speak, but it was his own voice that came. "With this mirror I see you. With this breath I bind you. With this vow I stay." When he woke, the words were still in his mouth, and the mirror had changed. Two reflections now, his and hers, side by side. The apartment was no longer an apartment. It still had walls, a ceiling, and windows. The doors still opened, and the floorboards still creaked beneath his feet. But something had changed. It began with the roots. Thin at first, like threads of hair, creeping from the corners of the workroom,
coiling gently along the floorboards, vanishing beneath the tatami mats. He noticed them as he stepped out of bed one morning, brushing his heel against a rough strand that hadn't been there the night before. By noon, they had grown thicker. By dusk, they'd taken shape. Not randomly, not like a plant growing wild. The roots were forming a path, and it led to the mirror. Takashi stood in the center of the workroom, watching. The roots reached out like fingers from the baseboard, pulsing faintly with sap, but not green, not living. They were the color of wet cedar bark, and they carried the scent of something old. Not rot, not quite. Closer to earth, heavy, damp, ancestral. From the mirror, fog drifted in slow spirals, rising just above the floor and curling along the walls like breath searching for lungs. Outside, Tokyo hummed with invisible life. Inside, Takashi could hear none of it, only the creak of the floor, and her. She appeared more easily now. The mirror no longer needed mist or silence to summon her. Sometimes she arrived when Takashi blinked, sometimes while he stood brushing his teeth. Sometimes she was already there when he entered the room, watching, patient, like someone waiting at a train station for someone who would never come. But tonight, she was closer than ever. He sat before the mirror, wrapped in the silence of red incense smoke, his hands resting on his knees, his breath slow and even. And the bride stood behind the glass, veil gone, eyes dark and hollow, but peaceful. He whispered, "I know you're not evil." She did not answer. He continued, voice like a prayer, "You're just unfinished." The mirror flickered, and for the first time, it didn't show her. It showed him. Not as he was, but as he had once been, a younger Takashi, smiling, holding his wife's hand in a garden long gone. It was a memory he had never photographed, a moment that had lived only in his mind, and yet the mirror had pulled it forth, made it visible. He reached out instinctively, and the mirror reached back. Suddenly, the apartment shifted. The walls groaned softly, not in collapse, but in transformation. The floor beneath him thickened, layers of moss spreading like fabric over tatami. The wooden beams above seemed taller, darker, as though aged by decades in seconds. The room filled with forest sounds, a breeze that didn't blow, a bird call that didn't echo, the heavy hum of unseen roots expanding through unseen soil. He looked down. His feet were buried in moss, his hands stained with cedar sap, and before him the mirror no longer reflected. It opened. The bride stepped through. Her feet left no sound. Her kimono trailed behind her like river silk, the red of it darker than before, as if it had soaked in night. She stood inches from him. Their eyes met. And in that moment he felt the weight of her waiting. Decades folded into fog, into stillness, into this tiny room that was no longer in Tokyo and no longer his. "Why me?" he asked again. Not in fear, in sorrow. The bride tilted her head, not confusion, recognition. "Because you looked when no one else would. I was only taking pictures. You saw me." I swallowed. "What happens now?" Her lips parted, not to speak, to offer. She raised her hands. In her palms, two things: a black wedding robe, his size, and a single white thread, shimmering, suspended between her fingers like spider's silk. He didn't take them, but he didn't step back. Behind her, the mirror pulsed again, and he saw something else. The workroom, but twisted, transformed, covered in fog, roots curling along the ceiling like veins, candles burning without flame, walls painted in calligraphy he couldn't read, and in that room another him, dressed in black, smiling, waiting. He woke on the floor. The mirror was still in its place, the room dim, but the roots were real, coiled around the baseboards, cracking the plaster, climbing toward the ceiling. That night, Takashi nailed the door shut, not to keep something out, to keep something in. He sat on the floor of his bedroom, staring at the gap beneath the door, where tendrils of fog now crept through slowly, softly, like breath exhaled from another world. He couldn't stop shaking, but not from fear, from knowing that whatever this was, it wasn't done with him. Not yet. In the kitchen, the faucet dripped blood-red water. In the mirror above the sink, he saw wedding guests, silent, eyeless. On his walls, shadows of tree branches moved without wind. He tried to call someone. No one answered. No one ever would again. By morning, the roots had spread to the hallway, and the mirror was glowing, faintly, like an altar, like a heartbeat, like a promise.
The room no longer had edges. The walls had softened, blurred by fog and overgrowth. Roots coiled around the light fixtures, creeping down in quiet spirals like veins pulsing with unseen blood. Red silk ribbons hung from the ceiling, swaying gently in still air. Shoji paper rustled without wind. Time no longer ticked forward. It circled. It spiraled. And in the center of it all, the mirror waited, glowing softly, whispering without sound. Takashi Mori stood barefoot in the middle of his apartment, wrapped in ceremonial black. He didn't remember dressing. He didn't remember unfolding the robe, but it fit as if it had been made for him. Long, flowing sleeves, the collar stitched with faint threads shaped like cranes, their wings closed in mourning. The room smelled of cedar, of incense, and of something older, something that once belonged in a shrine lost to ash and soil. He didn't question it anymore. Not the mirror, not the roots, not the silence, not even himself. Before him, the mirror had changed again. It no longer reflected. It reversed. Within the glass, he saw his workroom, but not his version. This one was cleaner, untouched by time, filled with warm light and delicate shadows. The floor was polished wood, lacquered black, and shining like still water. And she stood in the center. The bride, Sanae, veil lifted, eyes closed, hands folded in front of her, waiting. A hush filled the room, thick, sacred, like the air before a ritual. Candles lit themselves, their flames burned blue. The walls began to hum, low, deep vibrations, as though the very bones of the building remembered the words once spoken there. A sound rose from the mirror, not music, not voices, but the echo of footsteps down a long hallway, ceremonial, measured, inevitable. Takashi did not move. He drifted, drawn by something beyond thought, beyond grief. As he stepped forward, the mirror rippled, and he passed through. Inside the mirror, the world was both smaller and endless. He stood within a ceremonial space, an impossible place carved from memory and longing. Tatami mats unrolled beneath his feet like waves of silence. Lanterns floated mid-air, their light the color of dusk. Sanaya stood across from him now. Her hair was pinned with bone combs. Her kimono shimmered, not red, but the deepest shade between blood and nightfall.
Her face was calm, her lips closed, her hands outstretched. In one she held a ring, in the other a piece of folded paper, a vow never spoken. He took them both. His hands did not tremble. A voice echoed above them, deep, formless, ancient. It did not speak in language. It chanted. The mirror marriage had begun. Takashi placed the ring upon her finger. It slid on easily, though her skin felt colder than glass. Sanae lifted the vow to her lips and whispered it aloud. Her voice was gentle, beautiful, dead. Then she placed her hand over his chest. He felt warmth radiate into him. Not fire, not touch, but belonging. The roots that had followed him curled around his ankles like cords of devotion. From above, a single strand of red thread descended and tied itself between them, finger to finger. Not rope, not chain. A bond. Then came the kiss. Ceremonial. Quiet. Her lips met his without sound, and the mirror pulsed. Once. Twice. 3 times. A wedding drum with no hands. And then, everything stopped. No sound, no movement, just light. Endless, white light. Takashi opened his eyes to find himself kneeling on his apartment floor, back in Tokyo, back in the world, but not the same, never the same. The mirror was no longer leaning against the wall. It now stood on a raised platform of black wood, adorned with incense, flanked by candles. A shrine. His apartment smelled of smoke and flowers that had not bloomed in decades. On the floor before the mirror lay 2 wedding robes, folded perfectly, side by side, and in the mirror 2 reflections. 1 man, 1 bride, both smiling. Takashi stood. His body felt lighter, his limbs fluid, his breath steady. He approached the mirror one final time and pressed his hand against the glass. This time, it gave way like water, and the reflection pressed back. Their hands met, their eyes locked, and the silence between them whispered one final vow. Now we are whole. The world beyond the mirror was not what he expected. It wasn't black or hollow or cold. It was still, silent. A silence so thick it had weight, like snow before it falls, or breath held in the mouth of God. Takashi stood on a floor made of polished stone that shimmered like wet obsidian. The sky above was neither day nor night, just a suspended twilight, amber and pale, tinged with the faintest echo of sorrow. No wind, no warmth, just stillness and her. Sanae stood ahead, her veil gone, her eyes soft. Behind her stretched a corridor lined with floating lanterns, each one glowing faintly, each one cradling a face inside. Not alive, not dead, just reflected. Takashi stepped forward slowly, his bare feet making no sound. The space was neither warm nor cold. Time neither passed nor paused. It simply waited. As they walked side by side, the corridor widened into a great hall. But it was not a hall built of wood or stone. It was formed entirely of mirrors, floor, walls, ceiling. Endless panes of glass, each angled slightly, some distorted like carnival illusions,
others so clear they felt like windows into other lives. He saw himself in one, young, laughing with his wife on their honeymoon. In another, old, hunched, sitting in a chair no longer in his apartment. In another, gone. Just Sanai, staring into an empty frame. He turned away. "I don't belong here," he whispered. But Sanai only looked at him with patience of a spirit who had waited half a century. "You crossed willingly," she said. Her voice was the sound of rainfall in a quiet shrine. "I crossed to help you finish," he replied. A flicker of sadness in her eyes. "No one who completes the mirror vow returns unchanged." He stepped back, just once. The floor did not move, but the reflections around him began to shift. Each mirror showed a different man now. Each one, himself. Each one dressed in black. Some smiling, some screaming, some silent, their hands pressed against the glass as though trying to escape. A sickening realization spread in his chest. "I'm not the first," he said softly. Sanai turned her gaze away. "You're the first who saw me as more than a ghost." The mirror world pulsed, and suddenly the mirrors around them filled with people. Men of all ages, dozens, hundreds, some kneeling, some bowed, some broken, trapped. Eyes blank, mouths shown shut, and in every one the same thread of red silk coiled around their wrists, tied to nothing, tethered to a promise unfulfilled. Takashi's breath caught. "I'm not a groom. I didn't make the vow." "You didn't have to," she whispered. "You finished it." She reached out and touched his chest, and he felt it. Not pain, but weight. Roots curling around his ribs, fingers of fog in his lungs, the taste of incense on his tongue, permanent now. "I don't want this," he said. But already his reflection in the floor was changing. His hair was darker, his posture straighter, his face calm. Too calm. He ran, down corridors that bent in impossible angles, past reflections that whispered his name in voices that sounded almost like his own, through doors that opened into other rooms, copies of his apartment, each subtly wrong. One smelled of seawater, one was filled with floating candles, one had no ceiling, only a sky of mirrors that rained down soft sobbing. And in every room, the mirror waited, always centered, always open. In one chamber, he found them. The other grooms, pressed behind glass, their faces pale, their eyes wide with silent screams. One reached out toward him, fingers bloodied, lips mouthing a single word over and over, "Run!" But it was too late. The room folded inward, like a flower closing at dusk. He fell to his knees. Sanai stood above him, her hands trembling, not with malice, with sorrow. "You're not a prisoner," she said. "You're my memory, my mirror, my vow." Tears welled in her eyes. "Don't you see? I never meant to keep you." "Then let me go," he pleaded. "I can't," she whispered. "You're the only one who ever stayed." Then the world shattered, like glass dropped on stone.
Light exploded in every direction, and when it cleared, he was back. His apartment, silent, still. But now, the workroom was gone. In its place, a shrine. The mirror sat perfectly upright, fogged gently. Before it, 2 cushions, 2 teacups, 2 wedding robes. And in the mirror, Sanai, alone, crying. He stepped forward. His reflection met him. They touched the glass, and in that touch, a heartbeat. His, hers, one. The air in Tokyo had changed. Takashi could feel it in the walls, in the light through the curtains, in the water that no longer steamed when boiled. His apartment had grown too still, like a photograph frozen just before something terrible entered the frame. The mirror no longer fogged, it simply watched. Sanae was no longer weeping. She waited, calm, silent, certain. And Takashi was no longer sure where he ended and she began. That morning he rose before the sun and packed a small bag, a thermos of tea, his camera, the black wedding robe, and the mirror. It wasn't an act of desperation. It was devotion, not to her, but to truth, to whatever waited at the cedar tree that had rooted itself into his bones. Aokigahara greeted him with fog, not thick, not choking, but familiar, like a shawl draped over old grief. He stepped beyond the final trail sign, boots pressing into moss, his shoulders steady beneath the weight of memory and glass. The birds did not sing. The forest did not resist. In fact, it welcomed him. Every step deeper into the sea of trees felt like a breath held longer than lungs could bear. And then the clearing, untouched, waiting. He knelt at the base of the old cedar, the one whose roots had first revealed the mirror weeks ago. Or was it longer? Time had unraveled for him. He placed the mirror gently into the cradle of gnarled wood and sat before it in silence. Not to pray, not to plead, to return. The mirror did not glow. It did not fog, but in its still surface she appeared. Sanae, not dressed in red this time, but white, pure white, a wedding robe meant for peace, not longing. Her eyes no longer carried grief, they carried release. "Thank you," she whispered. Takashi's throat closed. "I didn't finish the ritual." "You did," she answered. "You stayed." "But I don't belong here," he breathed. "I want to go back." She nodded, slowly, and her next words pierced him like the wind that moves through the trees without ever touching a single leaf. "Then return me first." He didn't understand, but his hands moved on their own. He lifted the mirror gently from the roots, turned it to face the cedar, and as the glass caught the tree's reflection, something left. A breath, a sigh, a final vow finally exhaled. Sanae's image faded slowly, peacefully, like the last flame of a paper lantern drifting out over a still lake. Takashi sat there until the light dimmed and the shadows curled inward. The mirror was blank now, not broken, just emptied. Whatever had filled it, love, grief, ritual, her, had passed on. He wrapped it in the scarf he first found it in and pressed his forehead to the roots of the cedar. "May you rest," he whispered. He returned to the path without fear. The forest no longer felt like it wanted to keep him. It had released him too. But when he reached the edge of the woods, something was wrong. The trail had shifted. The signs were missing. The air no longer smelled of pine and mist, it smelled of incense. And when he checked his phone, it had no time, no date, no signal. He turned and saw the mirror, resting gently in the center of the path. Though he had left it behind, though he had buried it deep, it had returned. He lifted it in shaking hands and turned it slowly, and in its surface, two figures, bride and groom, standing in a forest that looked just like this one, only quieter, only darker, only still. He whispered, "No!" But the forest did not answer. Only the mirror did, and it showed him something else. His apartment, his workroom, empty, dust-covered, silent, as if no one had lived there in years. Takashi fell to his knees, not from fear, but from knowing, from the unbearable clarity that this wasn't a haunting, it was a trade, and the forest had been patient. He left the mirror at the foot of the cedar once more, wrapped it in red thread, and buried it beneath roots older than sorrow, and walked on, even though he knew it would never be far behind. He left the forest, but the forest did not leave him. Back in Tokyo, the world had resumed its pace. Trains rattled through tunnels, vending machines buzzed under neon signs, and school children laughed beneath umbrellas in the early autumn rain. But none of it touched him. Takashi walked through it like a ghost, unaware of his death. The apartment was just as he had left it, but it felt like someone else's life, or worse, like no one's. There were no signs of recent living, no used cups, no wrinkled bedding, no burned incense. Even the framed photographs on the wall of his wife, of the city skyline, looked faded, as if the light had given up on them too. He placed the wrapped mirror in the center of the workroom, gently, almost reverently. Then he sat before it and waited. That night, the dreams returned, but they were not his. He saw a girl, young, quiet, often alone, walking barefoot through her family's home in Minobu. Her name was Sanai, though no one in the dream ever spoke it. She knelt before a lacquered mirror each morning, brushing her hair in silence. She folded letters she never sent. She embroidered cranes into a wedding robe she would never wear. He saw her visiting the shrine near the foot of the mountain, placing dried white flowers in a small wooden bowl beside the altar. He saw her reading an old prayer book, tracing lines written not in ink, but in ashes. And then he saw her alone, kneeling before the cedar tree in Aokigahara, the mirror before her, the veil over her face, her hands trembling, murmuring the first lines of a vow that would never be completed. And then darkness. Takashi woke with tears in his eyes, not from fear, from memory. They weren't his, but they lived in him now. The mirror had unwrapped itself. It sat upright once again, uncovered, silent, its surface fogged not with mist, but with breath, as if it had exhaled overnight, or perhaps remembered. He rose and walked to it slowly, barefoot across a floor that felt unfamiliar beneath him. He looked into the glass, and this time it didn't show him, it showed her. Not as the ghostly bride, but as a child,
as a sister, as a daughter kneeling beside a family shrine, whispering apologies to a photo in a wooden frame. She saw her dancing once in the rain, long before grief had carved her hollow. She laughed, then waiting, then waiting, then waiting. And finally, it showed him, Takashi, not as he was, but as she saw him. A man with quiet eyes, a steady voice, a soul frayed by loss, but not yet broken. Someone who had looked into the mirror and hadn't looked away. Someone who listened. Someone who stayed. The mirror pulsed, and the image changed. Now it showed the forest, not Aokigahara as it is, but as it remembers, fogless, bright, filled with lanterns hanging from the trees like stars, and beneath one cedar tree, a red ribbon, untied, drifting, free. Takashi pressed his palm to the mirror and felt warmth, real, present, final. Sanai appeared once more, not dressed in red, not veiled, just herself. She bowed deeply, not as a bride, as a farewell. And then her image faded, not vanished, just released, like steam from a teacup rising until it's part of the air. The mirror was empty again, still fogged, still quiet, but somehow no longer watching, just waiting for light. Takashi sat back. The room felt lighter, the silence softer. The roots were gone, the scent of incense gone, the sense of being watched gone. What remained was something deeper, something he couldn't name, a knowing. He stood, walked to the kitchen and made tea. For the first time in weeks, the water boiled normally. The surface didn't ripple with voices. He poured 2 cups. One he placed on the floor in front of the mirror. The other he drank in silence, not in ritual, in peace. He didn't speak to her again, and she never returned. But sometimes, in the reflection of a still window or the surface of his tea, he would see the faintest shimmer, a ripple, a veil, a hint of red silk just beyond focus. Not haunting, not lingering, just a memory. Remembered. Because that's what the mirror was now. Not a portal, not a curse. A witness to a love too strong for death to silence, and to a man who, for once in the long tale of grief and forgetting, did not look away.
The days passed quietly after that, or so it seemed. Takashi no longer dreamed of Sanai. The mirror no longer wept. The walls no longer creaked at night, and the fog no longer crawled across the floor. His apartment returned to its original shape, neat, modest, filled with morning light and the ordinary scent of tea leaves and old books. But the silence was different now. It wasn't absence, it was watchfulness. Sometimes he would forget for hours at a time that the mirror was even there. He would go to the market, take the train, photograph quiet streets. He would hear the city again, the hum of vending machines, the chatter of children outside the window. He even laughed once, watching a cat try to swipe noodles from a vendor's cart. But when he returned home, he always paused at the door, because the air inside was never quite the same as the air outside. He kept the mirror uncovered now, not as an invitation, as a courtesy, like you might leave a chair empty at the table for someone who never truly left. One evening, while organizing his photographs for a new exhibit, he noticed something strange. In nearly every frame he had taken since returning from Aokigahara, from rooftops, from alleyways, from train platforms, there was always something in the far background. A figure, barely visible, always in red, standing still, watching. At first he dismissed it as pareidolia, his own mind trying to assign shape to shadows, to fog, to clothing lines caught in motion. But as he flipped through image after image, a cold unease threaded through his spine. The figure was always in the same pose, veiled, hands folded, still. That night, he lit incense again for the first time in weeks, not for ritual, for reassurance. He sat before the mirror, knees folded, and stared into the glass. It showed only him, quiet, tired, older than he remembered. But behind his reflection, just faintly, he saw it, a veil, drifting like a breath behind his shoulder. He didn't turn. He whispered, "You're still here, aren't you?" No reply, but the flame of the incense danced once, then stilled. He began to notice other things, small things, the scent of her perfume in his coat sleeve, the faint imprint of a second cup on the table, even though he drank alone, a crease in the pillow beside his, as though someone had rested there. And the mirror, it began to hum again, softly, like a lullaby remembered from childhood, a sound that didn't fill the room, only the space between thoughts. Then came the night he awoke to find his reflection watching him, not staring, watching. His own body still lying in bed, but his mirrored self already sitting upright, eyes wide open, mouth slightly parted. He blinked. The reflection didn't, not for several seconds. When it finally did, it smiled, soft, almost loving. The next day, he sealed the workroom, not out of fear, out of reverence. He taped the door frame with paper charms written in careful ink. He lit a candle outside the door every morning. He placed fresh water in a bowl and whispered prayers he didn't fully understand, not to banish, to honor, because he was beginning to understand something deeper than the ritual. This wasn't about exorcism. This was about cohabitation. She was not trapped anymore. She had simply stayed, not as a curse, not as a ghost, but as a presence, familiar, quiet, unseen, unleaving. Weeks passed. The leaves outside turned brittle with the cold. Tokyo exhaled into early winter. One night, while editing a series of photographs, Takashi saw something new. In one image, taken from the window of a passing train, his reflection stared back from the glass. But this time, there were two reflections, side by side. He zoomed in. It was unmistakable. A bride, veiled, standing just behind him, inside the reflection, hands folded, head tilted slightly, not in sadness, in affection. He didn't flinch. He didn't delete the image. He saved it, named the file, "She Never Left .jpg." That night, before sleep, he whispered into the darkness of his room, "Thank you for waiting." And from the corner, where the mirror now lay draped in white cloth, came a whisper so soft as if it had been a memory. "Thank you for seeing me."
The apartment was silent. Not the kind of silence that waits to be broken, but the kind that accepts itself fully. A peace made of fog, of memory, of things that no longer need to be said. It had been nearly a year.
The cedar roots had never grown back. The mirror had never moved. And Takashi Mori, the man who once wandered into Aokigahara searching for forgotten stories, no longer left his home. Not because he was trapped, but because he had nothing more to seek. Outside, the city moved on. New buildings climbed into the sky. Old ones vanished overnight. Faces changed. Voices shifted. But in this apartment, time unfolded slowly, like incense smoke curling into the corners, like pages turning in a book no one else could read. The mirror remained covered now, draped in soft white linen, not hidden, just resting. Every morning, Takashi still placed a teacup in front of it. Every evening, he still whispered a prayer he no longer needed to understand. And yet, there were days when he would pause at the door of the workroom, hand on the frame, breath held, listening. And sometimes, he swore he heard two people breathing. He no longer questioned his sanity. That had faded long ago, not from madness, but from merging. The boundary between the living and the lost had thinned, softened. He didn't see ghosts anymore, because they didn't need to appear. They were already here. One morning, the mirror uncovered itself. Takashi walked into the workroom and found the linen folded neatly on the floor. The mirror stood bare, polished, and perfectly still. Its surface didn't fog, its frame didn't glow. It simply reflected. He approached slowly, looked into the glass, and saw the room behind him. Books, light, tea steam rising. But not just that. He saw himself, standing at peace, older, tired, content. And beside him, a bride. No veil, no red, no shadow. Just Sanai, eyes closed, hands folded, standing with him. The mirror pulsed gently once, like a sigh, and then the image changed. The apartment was empty, dust floating in shafts of light, a teacup untouched, curtains unmoved, candles long melted down. But the mirror remained, and within it, two reflections. One man, one bride, both dressed in wedding robes, black and white, both standing still, not smiling, not weeping, just there, seen, together, bound not by curse, but by recognition. Outside, the world forgot them. No mail arrived, no neighbors knocked. The landlord assumed the man had moved away. The lights were always off, the windows always dim. But if you looked in through the crack beneath the curtain, sometimes, late at night, you might see something. A flicker, a shimmer, a movement behind the glass. And if you listen carefully, you might hear a voice. Two voices, soft, echoed, speaking a vow in unison. Now we are whole. Now we are home. The mirror never cracked, never dulled, never aged. It sits in that quiet apartment still, undisturbed, covered now and then by dust, but never forgotten, because mirrors never forget. They only remember in silence, and in that silence,
They keep what the world has no place for. Grief, love, vows spoken too late, and spirits who waited too long. In the end, all that remains is reflection. And sometimes, if you happen to walk past that building in Meguro on a foggy morning, you might glance at the third-floor window and catch your own reflection. Or maybe someone else's.